A man has always sought explanations for what he cannot easily understand. He has always looked for reasons to justify fear, guilt, and failure, and he has always sought a convenient place to lay blame. The devil, as he was imagined, is one of the most enduring creations born of this need. The figure of the devil is not a reality imposed upon the world. It is a mirror, a projection, a story crafted by humans to externalize the darkness they fear resides within themselves. By imagining an entity that tempts, punishes, or deceives, a man could avoid the difficult task of examining his own thoughts, choices, and weaknesses. It is easier to say the devil made me do it than to say I acted because of the impulses I entertained, the fears I nurtured, the desires I allowed to dominate me. The creation of the devil is a remarkable testament to human ingenuity and avoidance. It is the invention of an external scapegoat, a figure that allows men to absolve themselves without introspection. Consider the countless stories, warnings, and moral lessons passed down through generations. The devil is the tempter, the deceiver, the embodiment of evil. He is described as cunning, patient, and ever-present. Yet if one looks closely, the traits ascribed to him are not foreign. They are reflections of the patterns of thought that arise naturally in every human mind. Fear, envy, doubt, and desire, the very qualities that men fear will consume them, are projected outward onto a being that never existed except in imagination. It is far simpler to create a devil than to confront the mind, to acknowledge that every fear, every act of deception, every temptation to wrongdoing originates within oneself, is uncomfortable and even frightening. Humans prefer to externalize responsibility, to tell stories that allow moral failure to have a face and a name rather than accept that their own minds are the source of weakness. The mind is subtle, persistent, and often invisible to its owner. Its whispers, suggestions, and inclinations are easily overlooked or rationalized. By projecting these internal experiences onto a figure like the devil, a man avoids the labor of self-examination and the discomfort of accountability. This externalization provides immediate relief. Guilt becomes easier to bear, fear easier to manage, and wrongdoing easier to justify. If a man believes that an external devil has influenced him, he can maintain a sense of innocence, preserve his self-image, and continue acting without confronting the root cause of his choices. This is why the devil is often portrayed as clever, manipulative, and persuasive. He is the imagined externalization of the mind's own subtle influence, given form and personality, so that it can be blamed without reflection. It is an elegant psychological defense, one that has served humanity for centuries, allowing men to navigate guilt, moral complexity, and fear without acknowledging the responsibility that is, in truth, always theirs. Yet the danger of this projection is profound. By blaming an imagined devil, a man abdicates his greatest power, the power to observe and shape his own mind. When responsibility is shifted outward, the internal landscape remains unexplored, unexamined, and unmastered. Thoughts that encourage envy, pride, anger, or fear continue to arise and gain strength because they are not observed or challenged. The man continues to act under their influence, believing that the source of temptation is external, when in reality it is entirely internal. The devil becomes a comforting lie, a story that masks the truth, that all action, all impulse, all moral struggle originates within the mind itself. The creation of the devil also reflects a deep misunderstanding of human nature. Humans often seek simplicity in moral explanations, good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice. By creating a being responsible for evil, men can simplify the moral universe. The complexities of thought, the subtle influence of habitual patterns, and the continuous negotiation between desire and reason are reduced to a narrative that is easy to understand. The mind is complex, ever-changing, and difficult to master. The devil, by contrast, is simple, identifiable, and blameworthy. Men find solace in simplicity, even when it obscures the truth. In truth, every suggestion of wrongdoing, every impulse toward fear, anger, or desire is born in the mind. There is no external being that can impose it unless the mind allows it to exist. The devil, as a separate entity, is unnecessary. All of the power attributed to him exists naturally within the human psyche. Humans created him to avoid seeing what was already there, to avoid acknowledging that their own minds were capable of corruption, of temptation, and of moral failure. The mind is the true battlefield, the true source of challenge, and the true origin of choice. By inventing the devil, men could tell stories and assign blame without confronting their own responsibility. This does not mean that fear, guilt, or moral struggle are insignificant. They are real and they are powerful. Yet they are powerful because they arise from within. The mind is capable of constructing entire realms of torment or ecstasy, of creating anxiety or peace, of fostering cruelty or kindness. These outcomes are not imposed by an external devil. They are nurtured through thought, attention, and interpretation. The stories of the devil were created to externalize what could not be easily confronted, to give shape to the invisible, to provide a face to the forces that were entirely internal. Acknowledging this truth is uncomfortable, for it strips away the comforting narrative that someone else is responsible for temptation or wrongdoing. It requires a man to confront his own mind, to see the subtleties of thought that influence behavior, to recognize the persistent influence of fear, desire, and pride. It demands observation, reflection, and accountability. Yet it is also liberating, for once a man recognizes that the devil is a projection, he also realizes that the same mind that produces weakness can also cultivate strength. The mind that tempts can also guide. The mind that deceives can also clarify. The mind that doubts can also reason. All power lies within, not without. The creation of the devil, then, is both a testament to human creativity and a reflection of avoidance. Men constructed a being outside themselves to simplify moral struggle, to provide a scapegoat, and to avoid the difficult labor of observing their own thoughts. It is a story that has endured because it is comfortable, comforting, and deceptively logical. Yet the wisdom of a man who seeks mastery lies in seeing beyond the story, in recognizing that every temptation, every moral test, every impulse toward fear, desire, or wrongdoing is born within the mind itself. The devil exists only as a symbol, a story, a mirror reflecting what men refuse to acknowledge within themselves. By understanding this, a man begins to reclaim responsibility for his actions. He sees that excuses, stories, and external projections cannot dictate his life. He sees that the true source of influence, temptation, and moral challenge is entirely internal, and in this recognition, he gains the ability to observe, to question, and to direct the mind with clarity. The invention of the devil was a tool to avoid reflection. The choice to observe the mind is the tool to embrace mastery. And when a man finally sees that the devil was never outside him, he begins to act with integrity, clarity, and sovereignty over his own thoughts. A man often looks outward for the source of corruption, for the explanation of fear, failure, and moral weakness. He imagines that evil comes from outside, that temptation is imposed upon him by some external force, and that his failures are caused by influences beyond his control. This is the illusion that gives rise to the devil, a being blamed for every impulse, every lapse in judgment, every moment of weakness. Yet if a man turns his gaze inward with honesty, he sees the truth. The mind itself is the origin of both corruption and virtue. The devil, as imagined, is a convenient symbol, but it is the human mind that creates both the temptation and the capacity to resist it. The mind is a subtle architect of behavior. It whispers ideas, suggestions, and possibilities in every moment, presenting them as natural, reasonable, or even inevitable. Anger arises, desire surges, fear whispers, pride inflates, and without observation, these impulses can take root, grow, and direct action without conscious consent. Every act of wrongdoing, every instance of self-deception, and every moment of moral failure originates here, within the quiet spaces of thought. The mind is not inherently evil, Yet it is the only soil in which the seeds of corruption can grow. The imagined devil is simply a story told to avoid the labor of seeing this truth. Humans are remarkably skilled at projection. It is easier to point outward, to assign responsibility to an external figure, than to face the uncomfortable reality of internal influence. When a man blames the devil, he avoids examining the choices, habits, and desires that led to his actions. He avoids the subtle ways in which the mind has rehearsed, justified, and nurtured impulses that result in harm. Every justification for wrongdoing, every rationalization for fear, every excuse for weakness is a thread spun in the mind. The devil may serve as a scapegoat, but it is the mind that weaves the web. The danger of ignoring the mind is profound. By externalizing responsibility, a man forfeits the power to intervene, to correct, and to cultivate virtue. The mind, left unchecked, accumulates patterns of thought that influence perception, emotion, and behavior. Small habits of doubt, fear, envy, or pride, repeated over time, solidify into character traits. Choices that once seemed minor become decisive forces in life. The imagined devil may explain away temptation, but he does not halt its progress. Only awareness of the mind's subtle activity allows a man to act deliberately, to steer thoughts before they harden into behavior, and to reclaim agency. Every temptation begins as a thought. Before action manifests, the mind rehearses, evaluates, and interprets possibilities. The feeling of wanting, fearing, or resenting is not imposed from outside. It emerges within. When a man feels compelled to act unjustly, or to yield to fear, it is not because a being lurks beyond the senses. It is because patterns of thought, cultivated through repetition, attention, and interpretation, have shaped the internal landscape to make such action likely. Understanding this is uncomfortable, for it forces accountability. Yet it is liberating, for once a man sees the mind as the source, he also sees it as the solution. The mind is neither static nor fixed. It is dynamic, responsive, and profoundly influential. Thoughts arise spontaneously, influenced by past experience, imagination, and perception. Yet the response to these thoughts determines their power. A fleeting impulse toward envy can remain a momentary shadow, or can grow into a habit of bitterness, depending on whether it is observed, challenged, and redirected. A fear that whispers subtly can shape hesitation for years, unless a man recognizes it as an internal construct rather than an external imposition. Every mental movement carries potential for corruption or growth, and it is the man's responsibility to discern which path to reinforce. The illusion of the devil allows men to avoid the discomfort of self-reflection, but it also prevents growth. By believing that temptation is imposed from without, the mind is absolved of responsibility, and the man avoids learning the critical skill of self-mastery. True freedom arises not from denying the existence of evil impulses, but from recognizing them as internal events that can be observed, questioned, and directed. Every act of self-discipline, every moment of awareness, every deliberate choice to act according to principle rather than impulse, strengthens the mind's capacity to govern itself. Consider the patterns of thought that give rise to moral weakness. A man may nurture resentment in private, rehearse anger in imagination, or indulge envy in silent contemplation. Each repeated thought reinforces neural pathways shaping perception and behavior. The mind quietly engineers patterns that dictate future reactions. The devil, as imagined, may seem responsible, but he neither plants the thought nor decides its persistence. Only the human mind has this power. The external figure is a story, a symbol, a way to avoid the labor of observation, but it has no agency independent of the mind that created it. The mind also shapes perception. A man may see events as threatening, interpret actions as hostile, or judge situations as hopeless, and these perceptions are filtered through thought patterns established internally. The imagined devil may be blamed for fear, suspicion, or despair, but it is the mind that amplifies small suggestions into sweeping conclusions. Observation and deliberate interpretation are the tools by which a man can interrupt this process, redirect thought, and cultivate clarity. Without attention, the mind will continue to shape reality according to unexamined assumptions, and the external figure of the devil offers no intervention. Even the experience of moral struggle, temptation, and conscience is generated internally. Guilt does not descend from the skies. It is felt within the mind. The tug between desire and principle, between fear and courage, is entirely internal. To imagine that an external being imposes this struggle is to deny the truth of internal responsibility. The mind is the field in which all challenge occurs. Every decision, every moment of resistance, every choice to act rightly or wrongly arises here. Awareness, observation, and deliberate direction of thought are the only means to navigate it effectively. Acknowledging the mind as the source of corruption is the beginning of empowerment. Once a man sees that the devil exists only as a projection, he realizes that he also possesses the tools for mastery. The same mind that generates temptation can also cultivate discipline. The same mind that entertains doubt can also nurture clarity. The same mind that fosters fear can also produce courage. Every impulse that was once attributed to an external agent can now be understood as a signpost for self-examination and conscious choice. The internal origin of corruption becomes the internal source of liberation. The power of this insight cannot be overstated. Men who continue to blame the devil remain at the mercy of unobserved impulses, externalized fears, and habitual rationalizations. Men who recognize the mind as the true source of influence gain sovereignty over thought, perception, and action. Responsibility is not a burden, it is the doorway to freedom. By observing thoughts, challenging unhelpful patterns, and deliberately cultivating awareness, a man can prevent corruption, foster virtue, and navigate moral complexity with clarity. The creation of the devil was a psychological convenience, a way to simplify moral struggle and avoid the uncomfortable work of self-examination. Yet it also obscured the fundamental truth. Every impulse, every temptation, every moral challenge begins within. By seeing the mind as both the source of corruption and the source of solution, a man begins to reclaim agency over his own life. The internal landscape, once feared as a host of external threats, becomes a terrain to be understood and navigated and mastered. And when a man accepts that the mind, not a devil, governs both temptation and action, he discovers the profound freedom of responsibility. The mind, once feared as the origin of weakness, becomes the arena of mastery, and the power to act, to resist, and to create virtue lies entirely within himself. A man often struggles to see himself clearly because he is so eager to assign responsibility elsewhere. The act of blaming an external force, the devil, fate, or circumstance, is comforting. It spares him the discomfort of self-examination and the challenge of confronting the patterns of thought that govern his actions. Projection becomes a habit. Every moral failing, every lapse in judgment, every moment of weakness is attributed to something outside himself. Yet in doing so, the man avoids the most difficult and most transformative work he can undertake, looking within. The mind, not the imagined devil, is the true source of influence, and every act, every impulse, and every consequence begins there. Blaming an external force allows a man to maintain the illusion of innocence. When temptation is imagined as coming from outside, when moral weakness is attributed to an external being, guilt feels lighter. He can tell himself that the choice was not truly his, that the impulse was forced upon him, or that the deception was imposed. This story creates comfort because it absolves the mind of responsibility. Yet in reality, the mind is always active, always generating thoughts, interpreting events, and making decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously. Every action a man takes is the culmination of internal processes. The devil, as a narrative, only masks that truth. Projection of responsibility is not merely a moral concern, it is a practical one. When a man externalizes blame, he forfeits control. He looks to others or to imagined beings to explain his experiences, and in doing so he surrenders the most powerful tool he has, his ability to observe, evaluate, and direct his own mind. The mind is subtle. It works quietly, rehearsing thoughts, nurturing impulses, and influencing perception long before the man recognizes it. If the mind is left unquestioned, patterns of thought that promote fear, resentment, or indulgence grow unchecked. The imagined devil offers an explanation but no intervention. Only the attentive mind can alter the course of its own influence. Humans are skilled at rationalizing their projections. They create narratives in which external forces are responsible for internal struggle. The devil tempted me, a man says, or I was compelled by forces beyond my control. These statements feel truthful because the mind has rehearsed them over time, repeating justifications until they seem natural. Yet these narratives obscure reality. The source of temptation, weakness, and moral challenge is never outside. It is within. Thoughts arise, emotions surge, and desires pull at action, and all of this originates in the mind itself. To see this clearly is to reclaim authority over choice and consequence. Projection also allows a man to avoid the labor of self-discipline. A mind that is unobserved is easily swayed by desire, fear, and habit. Impulses are obeyed automatically, moral lapses repeated, and unhelpful patterns reinforced. By blaming an external force, the man avoids confronting the internal mechanisms that produce his behavior. He does not see that envy, anger, pride, or hesitation have their roots in thought patterns he has cultivated or allowed. The imagined devil may serve as a convenient excuse, but it cannot guide, correct, or strengthen him. Only acknowledgement of internal responsibility can produce growth. Every choice begins internally, even those that appear forced or inevitable. Before action manifests, the mind interprets, evaluates, and rehearses possibilities. Fear, desire, and doubt whisper suggestions, and the man decides, often unconsciously, whether to follow them. External explanations, whether divine, diabolical, or circumstantial, provide stories but no guidance. A man who wishes to live with integrity must recognize that the origin of choice resides entirely within. The mind is the stage on which temptation, doubt, and moral challenge play out, and it is the observer of the mind who gains the capacity to direct the performance. Observation of thought is the antidote to projection. When a man begins to notice the recurring patterns in his thinking, he gains clarity. He sees where fear has been rehearsed, where desire has been indulged, and where justification has obscured truth. Patterns that once seemed inevitable, the same anger, the same hesitation, the same indulgence, become visible. With awareness comes choice. The man can redirect attention, challenge impulses, and cultivate habits that serve purpose rather than satisfy habit or impulse. Projection, once comforting, is revealed as a mechanism that surrenders power rather than gains it. Projection also distorts perception. When a man blames external forces, he interprets events as imposed upon him. He sees himself as a victim of circumstance, tempted by unseen forces, and subject to manipulation. In truth, his interpretation is shaped by internal patterns. Fear makes events appear threatening. Doubt exaggerates obstacles. Desire amplifies distraction. The mind interprets reality through the lens of unexamined thought, and the imagined devil becomes a convenient explanation for what is, in fact, the influence of the mind itself. Recognition of this truth restores clarity. Events are filtered through thought, and mastery of perception begins with mastery of the mind. Even moral conscience originates within. Guilt, regret, and ethical reflection are internal phenomena. The tug between desire and principle, between impulse and restraint, is produced by thought and interpretation, not by an external agent. When a man attributes temptation or wrongdoing to the devil, he distances himself from the very faculty, his mind, that is capable of resistance, reflection, and correction. Every instance of internal conflict is an opportunity for insight, growth, and self-mastery. Blame, externalized, is a barrier to this insight. Recognition of internal origin is the gateway to transformation. The cumulative effect of projection is insidious. Small excuses, repeated over time, solidify into a worldview in which responsibility is always external, perception is always manipulated by outside forces, and internal power is ignored. A man who constantly blames the devil becomes a spectator in his own life, believing that events and impulses are beyond his control. He loses the ability to observe, evaluate, and redirect his own thoughts. The imagined devil is a comforting story, but comfort comes at the cost of agency. By refusing to project and instead acknowledging internal responsibility, the man reclaims the freedom to act deliberately. Awareness of this truth is empowering. Once a man sees that all influence, all temptation, and all moral struggle originates within the mind, he realizes that he also possesses the tools for mastery. Impulses can be observed, reframed, or redirected. Habits can be altered, attention cultivated, and perception clarified. The same mind that generates weakness can also cultivate strength. The recognition of internal responsibility transforms the mind from a source of fear into an arena of opportunity. This understanding also cultivates humility. The mind is powerful, and it can produce both virtue and vice. To deny the internal origin of influence is to live in illusion. To recognize it is to accept the profound responsibility that comes with consciousness. Every thought, every impulse, every repeated pattern carries weight. Every decision shapes perception, behavior, and destiny. By projecting responsibility outward, a man avoids this weight, but he also surrenders the ability to navigate life with awareness, integrity, and clarity. The projection of responsibility onto the devil is, in essence, a story humans tell to avoid their own reflection. It is clever, comforting, and persistent, yet ultimately deceptive. The mind, left unexamined, continues to generate temptation, doubt, and moral challenge, and the external figure takes no action, imposes no limitation, and provides no solution. Only observation, reflection, and deliberate engagement with the mind produce insight, mastery, and moral clarity. Every act of moral courage, every decision to resist impulse, every exercise of integrity is a triumph of observation over projection. By recognizing that the mind, not the devil, governs perception and choice, a man reclaims agency over his life. He sees the subtle ways thought shapes behavior, and he exercises attention and discernment to direct it consciously. External stories, once comforting, are no longer needed. All influence originates internally, and all mastery is born there as well. And a man finally stops projecting blame and begins observing the mind that has always guided him. He discovers a profound truth. The source of corruption, temptation, and moral struggle is the same source of strength, clarity, and freedom, and all of it resides within himself. A man rarely appreciates the subtlety with which the mind influences him. He imagines that temptation, fear, or moral weakness must arrive in bold, dramatic gestures, that they must shout, strike, or demand attention. But the mind, in its quiet and patient way, works differently. Its influence is not imposed from without, nor does it announce itself with force. Rather, it whispers, nudges, and suggests. The thoughts that lead a man toward indulgence, fear, or resentment do not roar. They insinuate themselves, gradually shaping perception, coloring emotion, and guiding behavior without ever drawing attention to the fact that they are doing so. This is the subtlety of internal temptation, and it is far more powerful than any imagined devil. The mind's suggestions are persistent precisely because they are subtle. A fleeting thought of envy, a quiet suspicion, or a momentary justification for indulgence can pass unnoticed. Yet these small suggestions are seeds. They take root, grow, and if repeated, become habitual patterns of thought that shape perception and decision. The danger is not in dramatic moments of temptation, but in the slow accumulation of unnoticed whispers that direct action before consciousness has fully registered their presence. The mind does not need to shout. A single repeated suggestion is enough to bend the course of behavior over time. Most men fail to recognize these subtle suggestions because they occur in the space between attention and action. The mind rehearses, interprets, and evaluates possibilities before a man is even aware that a decision has been influenced. The whisper of fear before a challenge, the quiet urge toward comfort over discipline, the internal justification that excuses wrongdoing, all of these are subtle manipulations by the mind. The imagined devil may be loud and dramatic, tempting with clarity and immediacy, but real influence arises quietly, in the recesses of thought that a man rarely scrutinizes. Subtlety makes internal temptation difficult to resist. Because it is quiet, it often bypasses immediate judgment. A man may notice the thought only after it has already influenced behavior, and by then, patterns have been reinforced. Repeated subtle suggestions form a scaffolding that supports habits, biases, and automatic responses. In this way, the mind constructs influence invisibly. The whispers of desire, fear, and doubt, when unobserved, become the architects of experience, shaping choices and actions without ever announcing their authority. The mind's quiet persuasion is also reinforced by repetition and attention. What is considered, entertained, or rehearsed in thought gains strength. A fleeting impulse that is noticed and questioned may wither, but one that is left unquestioned grows into habit. A whisper of resentment, repeated silently in imagination, becomes the basis of bitterness. A momentary indulgence in fear, allowed to occupy attention without challenge, becomes the framework for hesitation. This subtle accumulation is the mechanism by which the mind produces influence, not with force, but with patience, quiet, and persistence. Subtle internal influence also explains why men often feel powerless in moments of moral struggle or emotional disturbance. They believe that temptation arrives suddenly, externally, and with overwhelming force. They imagine a devil whose power is irresistible. Yet the true source of their struggle is the quiet, continuous work of their own mind. The whispered thoughts, unnoticed biases, and repeated justifications have already shaped perception and emotion. The moment of perceived helplessness is not imposed. It is the natural unfolding of patterns that were allowed to grow unchecked. Recognition of subtlety is the first step in reclaiming control. Observation is the antidote to subtle influence. A man who practices careful awareness notices the whispers before they gain power. He sees the impulses as they arise, evaluates their origin, and chooses whether to act upon them. The key is to witness the mind without judgment, to notice subtle suggestions and consider their consequences. Observation transforms whispers into conscious information, reducing the IR power to manipulate unnoticed. The subtlety of influence becomes a tool for learning rather than a hidden threat. For the man who sees clearly can intervene before habit and impulse dominate action. The subtlety of internal temptation also teaches patience. The mind does not rush, it works slowly, accumulating influence over time. A single indulgence or unobserved thought may not produce immediate consequences, but repeated quietly over days, weeks, and years, it shapes perception, decision-making, and behavior. A man who understands this recognizes that mastery is not achieved in dramatic moments, but in the patient, consistent practice of observing and directing thought. The whispers, when noticed and guided, can be transformed into insight, prudence, and deliberate action. Even moral failure, when traced to its origin, demonstrates subtlety. A man does not often fall into wrongdoing because of a single explosive temptation. He falls because of repeated whispers in the mind that have gone unnoticed, quiet envy that is rehearsed, small rationalizations that are entertained, subtle fears that are nurtured. Each contributes to a gradual weakening of resolve, and the man experiences the result as a sudden failure, unaware that it was constructed over time in the quiet corridors of thought. Understanding subtlety allows a man to see the roots of failure and to prevent it by addressing the underlying whispers before they manifest externally. The mind also employs subtlety the creation of rationalizations. Thoughts that support indulgence, fear, or avoidance are rarely presented as blunt commands. They arrive in the guise of reason, convenience, or self-protection. A man tells himself, "I deserve this," or "it's not so bad," or "I cannot help how I feel," and in these small, subtle rationalizations, the mind shapes behavior without force. By recognizing the mechanism of rationalization, a man can intercept subtle manipulation before it guides action, seeing the quiet work of the mind for what it is, and reclaiming sovereignty over choice. Subtle influence is not inherently malevolent. The same mechanisms that produce weakness can produce strength. Just as quiet, repeated suggestions can reinforce fear, resentment, or indulgence, they can also reinforce courage, patience, and virtue. The mind whispers guidance, offers insight, and presents possibilities. It is the attention given to these suggestions, and the conscious choice of which to cultivate, that determines whether the subtlety of the mind serves corruption or wisdom. The devil, imagined as external, has no influence. The subtle, quiet whispers of the mind do. A man who understands subtlety learns the art of attentive navigation. He observes the small inclinations, questions the quiet rationalizations, and monitors the whispers of fear, desire, and doubt. He recognizes that mastery is not about silencing the mind, but about guiding it. Subtle influence becomes a map rather than a trap. For every impulse, suggestion, and thought is an opportunity to practice awareness, discernment, and deliberate choice. In this practice, the mind is neither tyrant nor deceiver. It is a partner in conscious action. The subtlety of the mind also cultivates humility. A man realizes that influence is rarely dramatic, that power does not announce itself with force, and that control must be earned through observation and discipline. He sees how easily unchecked thoughts can shape behavior, and he appreciates the necessity of vigilance, patience, and self-awareness. Mastery is not achieved in moments of visible temptation, but in the quiet, often invisible practice of noticing, questioning, and directing thought. Ultimately, the quiet whispers of the mind remind a man that the source of both temptation and freedom is internal. No external devil can shape perception, emotion, or choice without the mind's consent. The subtle suggestions, repeated habits, and internal rationalizations are the true architects of experience. To surrender to them unobserved is to yield power. To notice, question, and guide them is to reclaim it. The imagination of an external enemy may be comforting, but real influence, and therefore real mastery, is always found in the subtle, quiet work of the mind. And when a man finally understands the quiet, patient subtlety with which the mind shapes action, he no longer fears imagined devils. He listens carefully, observes diligently, and chooses conscientiously, for he knows that every whisper of thought carries the power to corrupt or to guide, and mastery begins in the attentive silence between impulse and action. A man often spends his life looking for guidance outside himself, believing that the forces that shape his decisions, his fears, and his desires are beyond his control. He imagines that temptation comes from a devil, that failure comes from misfortune, or that weakness comes from the world itself. Yet the truth, which is both simple and profound, is that freedom and mastery begin within the mind. The mind is the origin of influence, the source of choice, and the arena in which all struggle occurs. To recognize this is to step into true freedom, for once a man sees that his mind governs perception, action, and consequence, he also sees that he has the power to direct it consciously. Self-awareness is the cornerstone of this freedom. A man cannot guide what he does not see. Thoughts arise in subtle ways, whispers of fear, fleeting impulses of desire, quiet urges of resentment, and without observation they accumulate and shape behavior before he even notices. By cultivating awareness, a man illuminates the hidden currents that steer him. He notices the small suggestions of his mind, the rationalizations that creep quietly, the rehearsed patterns that direct his attention and choices. Awareness does not prevent impulses from arising, but it allows him to choose whether to follow them or to act with deliberate intention. The mind, once observed, ceases to be a mysterious tyrant and becomes a conscious collaborator in action. Responsibility is inseparable from self-awareness. Once a man recognizes that all influence originates within, he must acknowledge that he is responsible for his choices. The devil, as imagined, offered a convenient scapegoat, a way to avoid discomfort, blame, and accountability. But by seeing that the mind is the true source of temptation and decision, a man claims the power that has always been his. Responsibility is not a burden, it is the doorway to clarity. When a man accepts that the patterns of thought he cultivates, the impulses he indulges, and the narratives he rehearses shape his actions, he also recognizes that he has the ability to shape them differently. The power to act rightly, to resist weakness, and to cultivate virtue resides entirely within him. Freedom through self-awareness also requires observation without judgment. A man cannot change what he denies, and he cannot correct what he criticizes without understanding. Thoughts will arise, fearful, indulgent, resentful, and the first act of mastery is to notice them. Judgment often obscures insight, turning observation into guilt or shame. The wise man simply observes. He notes the presence of fear, the pull of desire, the whisper of envy, and sees them as signals rather than commands. These thoughts are not commands imposed upon him. They are invitations to reflection, opportunities to exercise discernment, and reminders that every influence begins internally. Observation transforms potential weakness into the space for choice. Deliberate choice is the instrument through which freedom manifests. Once a man observes the impulses and suggestions of the mind, he can respond rather than react. Reaction is often unconscious, guided by habit, fear, or indulgence. Response is conscious, guided by purpose, principle, and understanding. Every moment becomes an opportunity to practice this distinction. When an impulse arises, the man asks, "Will I follow this thought, or will I direct it toward a higher purpose? Will I indulge fear, or will I act with courage? Will I nurture resentment, or will I cultivate understanding?" Each choice, exercised consciously, strengthens the mind's capacity to govern itself. Attention is another tool in cultivating freedom. The mind is shaped by what is given focus. Thoughts, when attended to, grow stronger. Impulses, when ignored, fade. By deliberately directing attention toward what is constructive, a man reinforces clarity, wisdom, and discernment. The whispers of fear and desire do not disappear, but they lose the power to dominate perception. Attention becomes the compass by which the internal landscape is navigated. Through careful focus, the man strengthens the structures of thought that support integrity, insight, and freedom, while allowing the subtle patterns that lead to weakness to dissolve. Patience is required for freedom through self. Awareness is cultivated over time. The mind has been shaped by years of habit, repetition, and reinforcement, and subtle patterns cannot be undone instantly. A single moment of observation, a single act of deliberate choice, will not immediately eradicate fear, desire, or impulsivity. Yet every act of attention, every conscious choice, every moment of reflection accumulates. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the mind begins to respond differently. Impulses lose their power, habits shift, and perception clarifies. Mastery is the gradual construction of internal freedom through persistent, deliberate engagement with thought. The practice of self-awareness also cultivates humility. A man sees the power of his mind to create both weakness and strength, to influence perception, and to guide action. He understands that he has been influenced by subtle patterns, by whispers of fear, desire, and habit, and he appreciates the patience required to reclaim sovereignty over thought. Recognition of this internal influence does not lead to arrogance, it leads to vigilance, to respect for the mind's subtle power, and to a commitment to exercise freedom responsibly. Freedom through self-awareness also extends to the understanding of external circumstances. When a man sees that his internal mind shapes perception, he realizes that events themselves do not control him. Circumstances, challenges, and even the behavior of others acquire significance only as they are interpreted within thought. The imagined devil may be blamed for misfortune or temptation, but it is the mind that filters, interprets, and responds. By cultivating awareness, the man recognizes that the same events can produce fear, anger, or insight, depending on internal response. External forces cannot impose corruption unless the mind consents. Freedom lies in this consent. Observation, attention, and deliberate choice are reinforced through reflection and practice. A man may keep a quiet watch on the mind's activity, noting recurring patterns, biases, and impulses. He may reflect upon his responses to events, examining moments when fear, indulgence, or resentment influenced action. Through this ongoing practice, patterns of thought become visible, habitual responses are challenged, and the capacity for conscious action grows. Each reflection reinforces the awareness that the mind, not an imagined devil, is the origin of influence, and that freedom is realized by exercising deliberate choice in each moment. The mind's subtle suggestions, once recognized, can even become allies. Just as unobserved impulses lead to weakness, observed impulses provide opportunities for insight and mastery. The same whisper that tempts toward fear can be seen as a signpost pointing to courage. The impulse toward indulgence can be observed and redirected toward discipline. Even doubt can be harnessed to clarify perception and strengthen reasoning. Awareness transforms the mind from a source of unseen influence into a conscious partner, a guide in the practice of freedom. Ultimately, freedom through self-awareness is the liberation from external blame. A man who sees that temptation, influence, and moral struggle originate within no longer fears the stories of devils or external forces. He understands that every impulse, every thought, every suggestion is an opportunity to exercise judgment, cultivate virtue, and act with clarity. The power to act rightly, resist weakness, and shape perception resides entirely within him. And when a man finally accepts that freedom is the conscious engagement with his own mind, he stops looking outward for guidance, blame, or excuse. He observes, reflects, and chooses deliberately, and in doing so, he discovers that true mastery, clarity, and responsibility lie not in external forces, but entirely within himself. A man spends much of his life searching for redemption outside himself. He imagines that salvation, correction, or transformation must come from forces beyond his mind, divine intervention, chance, or the punishment of an imagined devil. He hopes that external measures will correct the flaws he cannot face within, that some power outside will cleanse his fear, guilt, or moral weakness. Yet the truth, which is both simple and terrifying, is that redemption does not come from without. It is born within, in the careful observation, understanding, and discipline of one's own mind. The devil, the imagined force of temptation or corruption, exists only because a man refuses to confront his own thoughts. True transformation is only possible when he turns inward and faces the source directly. The mind is the birthplace of all moral struggle. Every thought, every impulse, every inclination to fear, envy, anger, or desire arises there first. Before action manifests, before temptation appears as an external force, it has already been rehearsed, interpreted, and nurtured in thought. A man who blames the devil or circumstance fails to see that these impulses exist independently of any external figure. The whispers of doubt, the quiet suggestions of indulgence, the rehearsed justifications for wrongdoing, all of these originate within. Redemption begins when a man accepts that the mind is both the source of struggle and the instrument of transformation. Confronting the mind requires courage. It is far easier to imagine a being outside oneself, a devil responsible for misdeeds, than to admit that the thoughts, fears, and impulses that dictate behavior come from within. To face the mind is to admit that every failure, every weakness, and every lapse in judgment has its roots in one's own patterns of thought. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. No longer can a man say, I was tempted by a devil, or I was forced by circumstance. Every impulse, every misjudgment, every moral lapse is now his responsibility. And with responsibility comes both burden and power. The first step toward internal redemption is observation. A man must watch the mind without judgment, noticing the thoughts that arise, the inclinations that push him toward indulgence or fear, and the rationalizations that justify weakness. Observation is not about condemnation, but about clarity. It is about understanding the machinery of thought, the subtle ways in which the mind shapes perception, emotion, and action. When a man observes his mind with honesty, he begins to see the origin of corruption and the pathways toward transformation. He notices the quiet whispers before they gain power, and he gains the opportunity to intervene consciously. Reflection amplifies this process. The mind is a vast landscape, and patterns of thought often extend beyond immediate awareness. By reflecting on behavior, on choices, and on recurring impulses, a man uncovers the deeper structures that shape action. He begins to recognize habitual patterns of resentment, fear, or indulgence, and the ways in which rationalizations have allowed them to grow. Reflection turns observation into insight, and insight into deliberate action. The imagined devil disappears, replaced by the recognition that the mind itself is the arena in which all transformation occurs. Discipline is the next stage. Awareness without action achieves little. Once a man sees the impulses and patterns that influence him, he must choose which to cultivate and which to redirect. Subtle impulses toward fear can be challenged and replaced with courage. Thoughts of resentment can be observed, questioned, and transformed into understanding. Desire can be acknowledged without surrendering to indulgence. Each act of deliberate self-guidance strengthens the mind's capacity to direct itself. The more a man exercises this internal discipline, the more the mind becomes a tool of mastery rather than a source of chaos. Patience is essential, for transformation is gradual. The mind has been shaped over years by repeated thoughts, impulses, and behaviors. No single moment of insight, no sudden recognition can undo the accumulated patterns of a lifetime. Yet each act of observation, reflection, and disciplined choice nudges the mind toward clarity, strength, and virtue. Redemption is not instant. It is the slow, steady work of aligning thought, perception, and action. The whispers that once led to weakness gradually become signals for conscious engagement, and the mind, once a source of subtle corruption, becomes an ally in deliberate living. Self-compassion is also necessary. A man must recognize that the mind will resist change, that impulses will recur, and that weakness will appear despite the best intentions. To meet these moments with judgment alone is to invite despair. Instead, a man who seeks internal redemption observes with patience, acknowledges the persistence of patterns without surrendering to them, and continues to guide thought with deliberate intention. The mind is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a field to be cultivated, and cultivation requires gentleness as well as discipline. The process of internal redemption also brings clarity about external influences. A man realizes that the world, others, and imagined devils cannot impose corruption unless the mind allows it. The mind interprets events, filters experiences, and directs responses. By mastering these processes internally, the man gains freedom from the perception of external tyranny. The challenges, temptations, and obstacles of life remain, but they no longer hold the power to dominate. The source of influence has shifted from imagined outside forces to conscious choice within, and with that shift comes a profound sense of sovereignty. Internal redemption transforms fear into insight. Once a man understands that the mind is the source of struggle and the instrument of change, he no longer fears imagined devils, moral weakness, or the weight of external judgment. Fear becomes a guide, revealing the patterns that require attention, the impulses that need observation, and the moments in which choice can be exercised consciously. The mind, once seen as a source of danger, becomes a mirror reflecting opportunities for mastery. Every impulse, every hesitation, and every whisper of desire carries information that can be used to cultivate awareness, strength, and wisdom. Ultimately, the recognition that redemption lies within is liberating. The man who stops blaming imagined devils, external circumstances, or chance discovers that he has always possessed the tools for transformation. Observation, reflection, discipline, patience, and self-compassion become the instruments by which the mind is guided toward clarity, integrity, and purpose. The devil, once imagined as a source of moral struggle, vanishes in the light of internal responsibility. Every temptation, every moral challenge, and every impulse is now seen as a moment of choice, an opportunity to act consciously, and a path toward true mastery. The culmination of this understanding is freedom and responsibility intertwined. The man sees that his own mind is both the origin of temptation and the source of redemption. He no longer searches for salvation in stories, external powers, or imagined devils. He observes his thoughts, reflects on his patterns, disciplines his impulses, and cultivates patience and compassion. In this engagement with the mind, he discovers that he has always held the power to transform himself, to act with integrity, and to navigate life with clarity and purpose. And when a man finally understands that redemption lies within, he stops looking for salvation outside, embraces responsibility inside, and realizes that the path to transformation, virtue, and freedom has always been entirely his to walk.